Late March snow still clung to the shoulders of Colorado's San Juan Mountains when Kayla Monroe, 17, clocked out of her shift at the Copper Lantern Café just outside Durango. Winter was losing, but not gracefully. The air had that uneasy in-between smell, wet pine needles and thawing mud, wood smoke drifting from chimneys, and the clean metallic sting that meant the ground would refreeze the moment the sun slipped behind the ridgeline. The cafe sat close to US 550, the kind of highway that carried tourists in the summer and isolation in the winter. Tonight, it carried mostly trucks and long silences. Inside, the kitchen heat had fogged the windows. Plates clattered. A tired radio played something upbeat that fooled nobody. Kayla wiped down her section with quick, practiced motions, untied her apron, and called goodbye to Walt Ransom, the older line cook who seemed permanently scented of onions and fryer oil. He waved without looking up from the stainless counter, as if he could see her through the steam. "Drive careful, kid," he said. "I always do," Kayla answered, because she did. She was cautious and small and stubborn, the kind of person who buckled her seatbelt before turning the key and double-checked that her phone was charged, even if it wasn't going to matter out here. She stepped into the parking lot beneath a flickering sodium lamp. Her car, an early 90s sedan with paint long past its prime, waited under a crust of road dust and salt. She was barely 5'3", brown hair pulled into a work ponytail, still wearing the uniform. Black slacks, white-collared shirt, the faint, unavoidable smell of coffee and dish sanitizer clinging to the fabric. In her pocket, she carried tips folded into a tight roll and a list of things she meant to do tomorrow. Call the community college, check on her GED transcript, see if she could grab an extra shift. Friends described Kayla as determined in the way that didn't make headlines. She'd left school early, earned her GED, and started stacking hours. She didn't talk about a better life as if it were a wish. She talked about it like a plan. That night, March 11th, 2012, she slid behind the wheel and turned the ignition. The engine coughed like it resented being woken up, then steadied into a rough idle that vibrated through the steering column. Kayla pulled out of the lot, tires crunching on gravel, and guided the car onto the dark stretch of highway, where the streetlights stopped and the mountain night took over. A grainy security camera behind the cafe caught her taillights moving away, a small red pair of dots swallowed by distance. The timestamp clicked forward into the part of the night where most people were asleep. Kayla never came home. By morning, her car had been found, but not in a ditch, not on the shoulder, not anywhere that looked accidental. A passing driver heading north saw the rear end of a vehicle jutting from tall grass near a spur road and pulled over, expecting to find someone stranded or drunk or hurt. What he found instead was a car backed hard into the side of a derelict building, an abandoned mining office left to rot, boards weathered gray, windows punched out years ago by teenagers and wind. The rear bumper was jammed into the structure with force, the trunk wedged tight against splintered wood, as if someone had thrown the car backward at the building on purpose. The driver's door hung open. On the ground beside the car lay a crumpled apron. Inside the car were a purse and wallet, keys, a phone. A jacket draped across the back seat like Kayla had planned to grab it, and then didn't. The engine was cold, and the silence around it, the hush of early morning in the foothills, made the scene feel staged, like a set waiting for someone to call action. No skid marks marred the road, no broken glass trail glittered in the weeds, no obvious blood, no sign of a struggle that the casual eye could see. Yet the geometry of the crash didn't look like panic behind the wheel, it looked like intent. If Kayla had driven here and done this herself, she would have had to choose it. And nothing about Kayla, her money folded in her pocket, her plans for school, her habit of texting her best friend when she got home, suggested self-destruction masquerading as a car accident. Within hours, the scene was wrapped in yellow tape. Detective Elena Marquez arrived with 2 deputies and a crime scene tech van that looked too clean for the mud and grimness of the place. Marquez was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, steady, and known around the region as someone who didn't chase the loudest theory. She chased the one that could stand up to light. She stood in the damp grass and studied the rear-end impact. The boards had cracked inward, a jagged mouth bitten into the wall. The angle wasn't random. The car had been lined up. Not a normal crash, she said quietly. Her partner, Detective Owen Mercer, crouched near the rear tire and pointed. No slide. No lockup marks. Marquez stared at the open door, the apron on the ground, the purse left behind like bait. She felt the slow bloom of a thought that made her stomach tighten. Staged, she said, or something close to it. They documented everything, photographed it, bagged it, measured it. A tech swabbed steering wheel, door handles, gear shift. They checked under the seats for anything tossed in panic. Receipts, a note, a set of unfamiliar keys. Kayla's phone was a cheap smartphone with a cracked corner. No outgoing calls after her shift. The last text message, earlier in the evening, was to a friend. Heading home, exhausted. Talk tomorrow. Her wallet contained cash enough to matter to a teenager working 2 jobs, and a laminated GED certificate she carried like a talisman. On the passenger seat lay a dog-eared community college catalog, pages marked at nursing programs in bright highlighter. The kind of careful hope people dismissed as ordinary, until it was all that was left. Nothing suggested she planned to vanish. Marquez started where the timeline was solid, the Copper Lantern Café. The cafe manager pulled up the shift sheet. Kayla had worked until late. A waitress named Brielle Sutton said Kayla had complained about her feet and joked about sleeping for a week. Walt the cook remembered Kayla leaving in a normal mood, tired but not shaken. No boyfriend drama tonight? Marquez asked, watching his face. Walt frowned. Not that I saw. She was polite, like always, quiet. But she wasn't scared. Marquez asked if anyone waited for Kayla in the parking lot, if anyone called the cafe, if anyone sat at the counter longer than necessary. The staff shook their heads. The camera footage confirmed Kayla walked out alone. No one followed her at a run. No second set of headlights idled behind her car. But the mountain night was wide, and cameras were narrow. When Marquez drove Kayla's likely route, she understood how easy it would be for a person to appear and disappear on these roads. Turnoffs into trees, old access trails. A vehicle could tuck in behind a stand of cottonwoods and vanish from view. The abandoned mining office sat less than a mile from the cafe, 5 minutes or less at midnight speeds. A small window, a sharp gap where anything could happen fast. That afternoon, Kayla's parents arrived. Mark Monroe was a carpenter who built cabinets and decks and anything that held together under pressure. His hands were rough, cracked, stained with varnish. The moment he saw the car, he circled it like it might speak if he touched it in the right place. He pressed his palm to the trunk lid where metal had buckled. Dana Monroe was a nurse at Mercy Regional, used to emergencies, used to blood and tears. Yet she stood there pale and stiff like her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. When a deputy handed her Kayla's jacket, she clutched it to her face and inhaled, as if scent could keep her daughter tethered to the living world. She wouldn't leave without this, Dana whispered. Not in March, not at night. Marquez watched them and thought about the cruel arithmetic of missing person cases. Every hour blurred a trail. Every phone ping and camera angle that might have mattered faded into normal noise. We're going to look everywhere, Marquez said, meaning it, because at that stage it was still possible Kayla had been dumped somewhere nearby, injured and hidden, in need of rescue. They mobilized. K-9 units tracked Kayla's scent from the open driver's door into the nearby forest, weaving between scrub oak and pine, until the trail ended suddenly in a patch of churned mud near a small service road. The dog paced, circled, whined, and then looked up at the handler like the world had been cut in half. "Vehicle pickup," the handler said, voice low, "or she got carried." Helicopters swept ridges and creek beds. Volunteers formed lines, calling Kayla's name into the trees. Searchers walked the riverbank, where spring runoff ran fast and cold. Deputies checked abandoned sheds and drainage culverts. The local paper ran Kayla's photo on the front page, soft smile, clear eyes, the kind of ordinary innocence that looked terrifying beside the word missing. Tips poured in like rain. Someone thought they saw a girl hitchhiking near a gas station. Someone heard a scream that could have been an owl. Someone insisted a dark van had been parked on a side road. Marquez logged every lead, investigated every one, and watched them crumble as reality sharpened. At a press conference in the Durango Civic Building, she kept her voice calm. "We are treating this as a potential abduction," she said. "If you know anything, any vehicle you saw, any person you noticed, any detail you dismissed, call us." Mark Monroe stepped forward, hands shaking. "Please," he said. "If you have my daughter, let her come home." Dana didn't speak. Tears did it for her. That night, Marquez returned to her office and drew the timeline on a whiteboard. 11:56 p.m., leaves cafe. 12:01 a.m., estimated arrival near mining office. 12:05 a.m., unknown. Dawn, vehicle discovered. She circled the gap. 5 minutes. "What happened in those minutes?" Mercer asked, standing behind her. Marquez didn't answer. She couldn't. A 5-minute gap was a canyon if someone knew how to use darkness. She started with Kayla's inner circle. Phone records, social media messages, school contacts, even though Kayla had left, co-workers, neighbors, any person who had reason to know Kayla's schedule. One number appeared too often in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Travis Keene, 24. A construction hand Kayla had dated briefly the previous summer. Kayla's best friend, Jenna Price, didn't try to soften it. "He got clingy," Jenna said, sitting rigid in the interview chair. Like, angry clingy. He acted like he owned her time. "Did he threaten her?" Marquez asked. Jenna hesitated. "Not directly. Not like, 'I'll kill you.' But he'd show up places. He'd call a lot. She blocked him, and he'd use another number. She didn't want drama, so she tried to ignore it." Marquez asked how often Keene showed up at the cafe. "A couple times," Jenna said. "He'd sit in his truck across the highway and just watch. Kayla hated it. She'd laugh like it was nothing, but her hands would shake when she counted tips." Marquez pulled Keene's file. Low-level arrests, disorderly conduct at a bar, a domestic complaint that didn't stick. Nothing that proved violence, but enough to mark a pattern of instability. She and Mercer drove to Keene's apartment on the edge of town, a tired complex with cracked sidewalks and a dumpster overflowing with cardboard. Keene answered the door shirtless, beard untrimmed, eyes already guarded. "I heard about Kayla," he said quickly, before Marquez could introduce herself. "I saw it online. It's messed up." Marquez kept her tone neutral. "We need to ask where you were last night." Keene leaned against the doorframe like he owned the angle. "Home, watching a game, drinking, alone." "No one can confirm that?" Mercer asked. Keene's mouth tightened. "I live alone." "When's the last time you talked to her?" Marquez asked. "Months ago," Keene said. "She ended it. I moved on." Marquez watched his eyes dart to the left, toward the living room, toward a phone on the couch, toward something he didn't want her to inspect too closely. "Jenna Price says you kept calling," Marquez said. "Kept showing up." Keene's face flushed. He laughed once, sharp. "Of course Jenna says that. She never liked me. She's trying to make me look bad. Did you go to the Copper Lantern last night? Marquez asked. Keene's jaw flexed. No. Do you own a vehicle? Keene pointed to the lot outside. Pickup. Gray. Right there. A pickup could carry someone, Mercer said after, as they walked back to their car. A pickup could carry a lot of things, Marquez said. We need something that isn't theory. They asked Keene to consent to a search. He hesitated, just long enough to matter, then shrugged. Go ahead. I've got nothing to hide. The search found nothing clean enough to be an answer. Normal apartment mess, tools, old work boots, fast food trash. No blood, no torn clothing, no trophies. Marquez left with the sense of a door closing, not opening. Back at the station, she typed the report anyway. Travis Keene. Prior relationship. Pattern of obsessive contact. No alibi. No physical evidence tying him to scene. Person of interest. Words that looked thinner than the grief in Mark Monroe's eyes. Weeks passed. Then months. The case didn't go cold all at once. It cooled in degrees, each fresh lead weaker than the last. Every search grid walked one more time with fewer volunteers. Every press conference attended by fewer cameras. Mark Monroe became a familiar sight on the highways outside Durango, stapling missing posters to bulletin boards and gas stations and laundromats. Dana returned to nursing shifts because bills didn't care about tragedy, but she spent her off hours calling advocacy groups, reading about forensic advances, learning how cases slipped when jurisdictions overlapped and communication failed. Marquez kept the file close. She was reassigned to other crimes, other emergencies. But Kayla's name stayed in the corner of her mind, like a persistent ache. A year in, a hiker found animal bones, it turned out. Another time, someone claimed Kayla had been spotted in Albuquerque. It was a waitress, who looked similar from behind. A rumor spread that Kayla had run away. Dana Monroe's face hardened each time she heard it, as if she wanted to slap the words out of the air. She didn't run away, Dana told anyone who would listen. She left her jacket. She left her money. She left her phone. That is not a girl running toward a new life. In the third year, Dana pushed for legislative change, better coordination, better protocols, faster statewide alerts. Local reporters dubbed it Kayla's Law because they needed a name that fit on a headline. The bill passed with polite speeches and solemn nods. Dana thanked them and went home to an empty bedroom that still smelled faintly of shampoo and laundry detergent. The law might help someone else. It didn't bring Kayla back. Marquez retired the following year. She didn't want to. Her shoulder was bad, her patience for departmental politics worse. On her last week, she visited the Monroes. Mark offered coffee with shaking hands. Dana sat at the table like she'd been carved from grief. I'm sorry, Marquez said, and hated how small it sounded. Dana reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You cared, she said. That mattered. Before leaving, Marquez slid a manila envelope across the table. Copies of her personal notes, theories, timeline revision attempts, details that never made it into official reports. On the last page, in Marquez's tight handwriting, was a sentence that wasn't proof, only instinct sharpened by years. Look closest. Obsession is motive. Opportunity was built into her schedule. 9 years after Kayla vanished, the story experienced a strange afterlife online. True crime forums discovered it. Then podcasts. Then a slick documentary crew that filmed drone shots over the San Juans and asked Dana to hold Kayla's childhood photo while soft piano music played. Mark refused to participate. Donna did one interview because she wanted people to remember Kayla as a person, not a mystery. She spoke carefully, refusing to accuse without evidence, refusing to let producers shape her into a caricature of grief. She liked stupid romance novels, Dana said on camera once. She wanted to be a nurse. She hated tomatoes. She loved those tiny dogs with the bug eyes. She was a full person. The internet responded the way it always does. Theories multiplied. Runaway. Trafficking. Serial killer. Bad drug deal. Secret boyfriend. Police cover-up. Every theory found someone willing to believe it. Marquez couldn't stand to read the comments. The loudest people were always the ones farthest from consequence. In the summer of 2021, the case changed, not because law enforcement made a breakthrough, but because civilians did. A volunteer dive and recovery group called High Country Recovery had spent years pulling submerged vehicles from reservoirs and quarries. They weren't thrill seekers. They were methodical. They worked with families and deputies. They ran sonar sweeps because water held secrets better than dirt did. The team leader, Hank Caldwell, was a former firefighter in his 50s, with a calm voice and a face lined by sun and smoke. He'd followed Kayla's story from the beginning, maybe because he'd seen too many tragedies end without answers. Maybe because he couldn't stand the idea of a girl vanishing 5 minutes from her workplace and nobody ever knowing. Caldwell came to the Monroes with maps. "There's an old quarry reservoir," he said, 8 miles from where the staged crash was. Deep. Black water. It's been abandoned for decades. People used to drive out there at night. Mark stared at the map as if it were a foreign language. The cops searched everywhere. Caldwell nodded gently. They searched with what they had then. Sonar can do things now they couldn't. Dana's eyes filled. "You think she's in the water?" "I think it's worth looking," Caldwell said. "Worth ruling out." Anything was better than not knowing. So the Monroes said yes. On a still July morning, Caldwell's team launched a boat onto water as dark as spilled ink. Pines reflected on the surface like ghosts. The sonar transducer dropped into the reservoir and began painting the bottom in lines. Debris, tires, old metal. The laptop screen glowed under the sun like a portal. 2 hours in, Caldwell stiffened. A shape emerged, rectangular, too clean to be stone. "A hold," he said, voice controlled. They made another pass. The shape resolved into a vehicle lying on its side in deep water. Caldwell marked the coordinates and called it in. County investigators responded, and with them came the new cold case detective assigned to Kayla's file. Detective Noah Park, late 30s, relentless in that quiet way that didn't require speeches. Park reviewed the sonar images and felt his pulse climb. Cold cases were mostly waiting for a conscience, a mistake, a body. This was something else. This was discovery. Divers confirmed it the next morning. The vehicle was there, silt-coated, algae-draped, settled into darkness like it had always belonged. The recovery operation took days. A crane, a barge, safety crews, media who showed up as if tragedy was a schedule. Mark and Dana stood behind the barricade, holding on to each other. Dana couldn't watch the cables tighten. She pressed her face to Mark's shoulder. Mark stared at the water, like sheer will could lift the car faster. When it finally broke the surface, water cascaded from the frame. The shape was recognizable. An older sedan, mid to late 80s. Park moved closer, heart hammering, and waited for the plate to be cleared. When the numbers emerged, his stomach dropped. The plate matched Kayla's file, but it didn't match the story everyone thought they knew. Because the car pulled from the water was not the same car still logged in evidence from the staged crash site. Park felt the case tilt on its axis. He went back to the earliest reports, those frantic first-week statements full of noise and confusion. Inside one early witness interview, he found a line nearly everyone had forgotten. Kayla Monroe had been borrowing a co-worker's sedan due to mechanical issues with her own. The staged crash vehicle, the submerged vehicle, 2 different cars. The staged crash hadn't been a failed accident. It had been a deliberate diversion. When the trunk of the recovered car was opened, the smell that rolled out was not the smell of water. It was the smell of time that had finished its work. Wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting were skeletal remains. Small, consistent with a young female. A purse, water-damaged, sat beside the bundle. Park opened the wallet inside with gloved hands. Kayla Monroe's ID stared back. Dana made a sound that wasn't a word. Her knees buckled. Mark caught her, and they sank together on the gravel as if gravity had changed. Park didn't need to speak. The truth spoke for him. With the recovery, the case became what it had always threatened to be: homicide. Park secured the vehicle and contents, transporting everything to the state lab for comprehensive analysis. Dental records confirmed identification quickly. The medical examiner's findings were blunt: trauma consistent with a heavy blow to the head. The timeline fit the night Kayla vanished. Park stared at the evidence and asked the question that cut deepest. If Kayla's body had been in the water for 9 years, whose car was backed into the abandoned mining office that same night? The staging now made sense. Someone had created a false crime scene, crashed a vehicle in a theatrical way, and left Kayla's possessions like breadcrumbs. The goal was simple: point the search in the wrong direction, while the real evidence sank under black water miles away. Park ordered the staged crash vehicle reprocessed with modern techniques. Forensic techs applied chemical reagents to the interior. Under UV light, faint luminescence bloomed on the driver's seat and the center console old traces, cleaned, but still there. DNA confirmed the blood belonged to Kayla. Park inhaled slowly and felt the case tighten into a shape he could prosecute. Injury or death in one car, disposal in another. A staged scene to delay discovery. Now, he needed the last link. Who? He returned to the name that had never disappeared from the margins of the file: Travis Keene. Park pulled phone records, revisited witness statements, tracked Keene's moves over the years. Keene had changed addresses, changed jobs, drifted like someone who didn't want roots. Park requested old fingerprint cards and compared them to partial prints recovered from the plastic sheeting. The match wasn't perfect water, and time degraded everything, but the probability leaned hard in one direction. Park built the rest carefully. Repeated unwanted contact, stalking behavior, access to the kind of plastic sheeting used, lack of alibi. The opportunity built into an isolated midnight highway. When Park finally located Keene out of state living quietly, working under his legal name, Keene answered the door, and recognition flashed across his face like a crack of lightning. Then fear. At the station, under cameras and bright lights, Keene denied, then demanded a lawyer. Park didn't flinch. In the new reality of the case, denial wasn't a shield, not anymore. The trial came later, after motions and lab reports, and months of building something airtight. The courtroom in La Plata County filled to capacity. Reporters lined the walls. Dana sat rigid with Mark's arm around her shoulders, both of them older now in a way that grief accelerates. Park watched from the prosecution table, a thick binder open like armor. The district attorney, Marianne Holt, laid out the story without flourish. A young woman with plans, a man who refused to let go, an isolated highway, a violent act, then a cover-up engineered to buy time. The defense attacked probability, attacked degraded prints, attacked the idea that obsession proved murder. They suggested alternate suspects: shadowy, convenient, faceless. But evidence has a stubborn weight when it stacks high enough. A forensic analyst testified about the blood traces in the staged crash vehicle and why cleaning didn't erase chemistry. The medical examiner testified about trauma consistent with a single heavy strike. Jenna Price testified about Kayla's fear, her shaking hands, the way she'd look out windows at night. and the prosecutor played old voicemail recordings recovered from Kayla's archived phone. Back up. Keene's voice, insistent, angry, pleading, turning sharp when she didn't answer. Mark kept his gaze on the floor during that audio. Dana stared straight ahead, face wet and unmoving, as if she'd run out of expressions years ago. When it was over, the jury deliberated for 2 long days. The verdict came back. Guilty. Dana folded against Mark like someone had finally released a cord that had kept her upright. Mark held her and sobbed in a way he probably hadn't allowed himself to for years, not because justice repaired anything, but because it ended the torture of uncertainty. The judge sentenced Keene to life. Outside the courthouse, Dana spoke quietly into a cluster of microphones. For years, people told us to accept not knowing, she said. They told us time would make it easier. Time didn't make it easier. Time just made it longer. She looked directly at the cameras, not angry, simply exhausted. If you have someone missing, she said, don't let them become a file. Don't let them become a rumor. Keep their name alive. That evening, the Monroes went to the reservoir. Not for closure is a word people use when they can't tolerate the messy reality of grief, but for a moment of stillness, a chance to place something gentle where something brutal had happened. High Country Recovery's team stood with them. Hank Caldwell held his hat in his hands. Detective Park watched the water and thought about how many cases waited beneath surfaces nobody wanted to look at. They placed flowers near a simple marker. Candles lit the shoreline. Dozens of small flames reflected on the black water like fallen stars. Dana whispered into the mountain wind, voice breaking but steady. We never stopped looking. And for the first time since that late March night, the story moved forward, not toward forgetting, but toward truth. If you want, send me Prodolzhai, and I'll keep expanding in the same style until we hit your 50,000 characters total across parts, so you can paste it as one full script. Вы сказали продолжай? ChatGPT сказал, the weeks after the recovery were loud, in a way the Monroes hadn't heard in years. For nearly a decade, their grief had existed in a quiet, private orbit phone calls that went nowhere, flyers that curled at the edges, candlelight vigils attended by fewer people each year. Then, suddenly, there were satellite trucks outside their street again. Reporters hunted angles. Podcasters requested exclusive sit-downs. Strangers used Kayla's name like it belonged to them. Dana Monroe started keeping the curtains closed. Detective Noah Park, meanwhile, had the problem that only came after a body was found. Now the clock ran in the opposite direction. Not, where is she? But who did it? And how do we prove it the right way? Because a charge was only as strong as the evidence behind it, and evidence was a delicate thing when it had been handled, moved, stared at, and guessed at for years. The state lab in Denver took custody of everything: the recovered sedan, the plastic sheeting, the purse, the old phone, the hairline scraps of whatever might still be there. The staged crash vehicle came out of evidence storage, too, re-examined with new eyes. Park didn't assume the original investigators did poor work. He assumed the case had simply happened at the worst possible time, when everyone still believed Kayla might be alive, and every decision leaned toward speed over permanence. That early assumption, the hope that she could still be found, breathing shaped everything. It was why the staged crash scene had initially been treated as a missing person emergency rather than a murder scene. It was why certain areas were searched quickly instead of preserved. It was why the truck ruts near the service road were photographed, but not cast. Why dozens of volunteer hands had moved through the woods, flattening grass, twisting branches, smearing away the clean edges of a trail. Park couldn't change that history. He could only work with what was left. He started with something simple, a true, clean timeline. Kayla worked late at the Copper Lantern Café. That was verified by shift sheets, staff statements, and camera footage. She left alone. That was verified too. The staged crash, sight less than a mile away, was discovered at dawn. The car had been backed into the abandoned mining office hard enough to splinter boards and wedge the trunk. Kayla's apron was outside. Her purse and wallet were inside. Her phone and keys remained. Her jacket sat on the back seat. And yet her body, based on the recovered remains, had been placed in the trunk of a different car, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, and sunk in deep water some miles away. 2 vehicles, 2 scenes. One goal: delay. Park pinned a map of the region to his office wall and studied it for hours at a time. Not just the route from the cafe to Kayla's home, but every side road, every pull-off, every dark strip of shoulder where a vehicle could sit without being obvious. He marked sight lines. He marked empty stretches. He marked places where cell service dropped off. He circled the reservoir, an old quarry cut that locals loved because it felt like a secret. He asked himself a question that annoyed some of the older detectives. Why sink a car at all? Because it was heavy. Because water hid it. Because a quarry reservoir was deep enough that even a thorough search could miss a vehicle without the right equipment. Because whoever did it believed the reservoir was final. That kind of choice suggested planning, and planning usually came from familiarity. Park reopened old interviews that had been dismissed years earlier as noise. Most were exactly that, people trying to be helpful, people reshaping their memories around fear. But buried inside those reports were small, factual details that hadn't mattered then and mattered now. A gas station clerk who remembered a gray pickup idling too long near the pumps after midnight. A neighbor who heard tires on gravel behind her house and assumed it was teenagers. A waitress who recalled Kayla complaining weeks earlier that someone keeps showing up where I am. Park wrote each detail on index cards and pinned them under categories: opportunity, access, knowledge, behavior, and one name continued to appear in the margins like ink that wouldn't fade: Travis Keene. The file on Keene was thick in the way a file gets thick when a suspect is never quite charged, but never quite cleared. Old phone records showed repeated calling in the weeks before Kayla vanished. Jenna Price's statement described him sitting in his truck across the highway, watching the cafe. Another co-worker recalled Keene showing up during Kayla's shift and staring at her like he was memorizing her face. So Park did the thing cold case detectives do when they're trying to cut through years of speculation. He re-interviewed people and watched for what stayed consistent. Jenna Price was older now, married, with a steadier voice. But when Park asked about Keene, her hand still tightened around her coffee cup. He didn't feel like a boyfriend, she said. He felt like a threat that wanted to pretend it was romance. Did Kayla ever talk about going to the police? Park asked. Jenna nodded once, sharply. She said it would make him madder. She said he'd just escalate. Park asked a question that had become standard for him. What did she say she was afraid he would do? Jenna swallowed. She didn't make it dramatic. She just said, I'm scared he'll do something stupid. Like she was talking about a storm. Like you can see it coming, but you still have to work your shift. Park wrote the sentence down and underlined it, not because it proved a crime, but because it showed the shape of fear before the night everything broke. Then he went after the physical evidence, piece by piece. The plastic sheeting was the hardest. Years underwater turned fingerprints into ghosts, DNA into fragments, everything blurred at the edges. But the lab recovered partial ridge detail from a protected fold, where plastic had overlapped itself in the trunk, and algae hadn't eaten as deep. The match returned as a probability strong, not absolute. and probability alone wasn't a conviction. So Park widened the funnel. Who had access to construction-grade plastic? Plenty of people. Hardware stores sold it. Job sites used it. It was common in the same way duct tape was common. But combined with a suspect who worked construction combined with phone calls, stalking behavior, the lack of an alibi, the geographic familiarity that plastic started to look less like a generic object and more like a signature of convenience. Park subpoenaed Keene's employment records from the period around Kayla's disappearance. He tracked which sites Keene worked on, who was supervising, where materials were stored. He took photos. He compared brands and thicknesses of plastic used at those sites to what the lab could still measure. Every piece didn't need to scream guilt. A case like this was built the way a bridge was built. Stress-tested connections, redundancies, a structure that held even if someone kicked at it. The next major pivot came from the staged crash vehicle. Under chemical testing, faint traces of cleaned blood lit in the driver's seat area, not in a pattern consistent with a scraped knuckle or a nosebleed, but in a way that suggested a substantial injury had been smeared and wiped. DNA confirmed it belonged to Kayla. That mattered for two reasons. First, it proved violence occurred in the staged crash car. Second, it meant the staged crash scene wasn't merely a fake abduction location. It was connected to the assault itself. Park sat alone in his office after that report came in and let the implications settle like a weight. There were only so many ways to make this make sense. Kayla leaves work alone. Someone follows or intercepts her very quickly. She ends up in the staged crash car, whether it's her own car or a vehicle someone else drove her into. The distinction mattered less than the fact. She bled there. Then she is transferred dead or dying into the other vehicle, wrapped and sunk, which meant whoever did this didn't panic in a normal way. A panicked person might flee, might abandon a body, might dump a car somewhere random. But sinking a car in a reservoir required time, location knowledge, and a willingness to do heavy physical work. Staging a crash required nerve. This was not a one-step mistake. It was a plan that evolved quickly but deliberately. Park re-examined Keene's original interview from years earlier and watched it again with fresh eyes. A younger detective had asked simple questions. Keene had answered smoothly. He offered consent to search. He played the role of the wronged ex-boyfriend. At one point he said, almost casually, "It's messed up, but I don't know anything." Park paused the recording there and stared at the screen. The words weren't suspicious on their own. It was the speed with which Keene said them. Too fast, too rehearsed, like a line he'd practiced in a mirror. Park picked up the phone and called an old contact in another county. Someone who handled domestic stalking cases. "What's the one mistake people like this make?" Park asked. The contact didn't hesitate. "They assume their story is the only story," she said. "They think if they say it confidently enough, you'll stop looking." Park thanked her and hung up, then turned back to the timeline on his board. 5 minutes from the cafe to the mining office, 8 miles the other direction to the quarry reservoir. 15 minutes, 20 if you drove carefully. When Park ran the routes himself at night, he realized something else too. The quarry road was rough, but not impassable. And if you were local, if you'd driven out there to party or to drink or to fight or to do whatever you didn't want seen, the darkness didn't scare you. It helped you. The case turned from possible suspect to primary target. When Park found a detail that had been ignored for years because it seemed too ordinary. A tow truck log. In the months before Kayla disappeared, her own sedan had been towed once for mechanical issues, exactly as the early witness statement mentioned. The suspect problem wasn't merely that she'd borrowed a coworker's car. It was that her own car had existed as an available object. A thing sitting somewhere accessible to anyone who knew where it was parked. Park pulled the tow records, then the repair shop's security footage. Grainy, partial, but enough to show a person entering the lot after hours the week of the disappearance. The face couldn't be seen, but the body language was clear. Purposeful. Familiar. The person didn't look like a thief hunting random parts. They moved like someone retrieving something. Park layered that footage against something else. Cell tower data. Not current pings. Those were long gone, but archived records tied to Keen's number. The data didn't provide a precise GPS dot. It did something quieter and more powerful. It showed Keen's phone connecting to towers consistent with that area, at a time he later said he was home. It wasn't a confession. It was a crack. And cracks were how you got in. Park didn't rush an arrest. He didn't want a defense attorney tearing apart procedure. He built the case with the district attorney's office, anticipating every argument and shoring up every weak point. When they finally moved, it was coordinated. Keen was located out of state, working steadily, living quietly. Not the life of a fugitive, but the life of someone who believed time had done its magic. Park arrived at the apartment complex with local officers. It was early before sunrise, because that's when people are least prepared to perform. Keen opened the door, sleepy and annoyed, then saw Park's face and went still. Recognition. Then something else. Fear. "Travis Keen," Park said evenly. "You need to come with us to answer questions regarding Kayla Monroe." Keen's expression flickered, one fast blink that said he understood the decade-long distance between missing and found. He swallowed, glanced toward the parking lot like he was measuring exits, then nodded stiffly. At the station, under bright lights and cameras, Park laid out what he could lay out without risking the investigation. "You called her 42 times in the 2 weeks before she vanished," Park said. Keen shrugged it off. "I wanted to talk. You were seen watching her workplace. People lie. We recovered a vehicle from the quarry reservoir. Kayla was inside." Keen's hands tightened on the edge of the table. The skin around his mouth pulled taut. "I don't know anything about a quarry," he said. Park didn't raise his voice. "Your probability match is on the plastic sheeting she was wrapped in." Keen's eyes flicked away, then back fast, calculating. "That's not proof," he said. "It's part of proof," Park answered, "and your phone data puts you in places you said you weren't." Keen stared at the table as if the wood grain was suddenly fascinating. Park leaned forward, careful. "Here's what we think happened. You followed her from work. You tried to stop her. She didn't do what you wanted. You got angry. You hurt her. Then you tried to fix it with staging, because you cared more about saving yourself than about what you'd done." Keen's breathing sped up. For a moment, Park thought the dam might break, not because Keen felt remorse, but because pressure makes people talk. Instead, Keen lifted his head and said the sentence Park had predicted he'd eventually say. "I want a lawyer." Park nodded and pushed his chair back. "That's your right." He left the room and stepped into the corridor, where the air felt colder, cleaner. One of the assistants from the DA's office, Mary Ann Holt, waited there with a folder tucked to her chest. "He asked for counsel," Park said. Holt's eyes were hard, not cruel-focused. "That's fine," she replied. "We're not building this on a confession anyway." Park exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "We're building it on everything else." And everything else was exactly what he spent the next months assembling. Phone records, witness statements, lab reports, route analyses, repair shop footage, cell tower connections, psychological behavior patterns that were not presented as certainty, but supported as context. The case wasn't flashy. It was heavy. It showed a young woman who had plans, a man who couldn't tolerate rejection, a narrow window on a dark highway, and a cover-up designed to erase a body and confuse a search. When the trial date was finally set, Dana Monroe didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, like someone checking off a step she'd been forced to live long enough to reach. Mark asked Park one question in the courthouse hallway before opening statements. "Do you think she knew?" Mark said, voice low. "In those last minutes, do you think she knew we were going to spend all these years looking?" Park felt the question hit him like a fist. He answered honestly, because honesty was the only thing worth offering. "I don't know," Park said, "but I know this. She didn't disappear. Someone made her disappear. And now we're going to say her name in a courtroom until the world has to listen." Mark nodded once, eyes wet, and walked inside. The courtroom filled the way courtrooms fill when a case becomes a community wound. When Keene was led to the defense table, Dana watched him without blinking. Not hatred, not rage, something colder. A focus sharpened by 9 years of waiting. Holt stood to deliver the opening statement, her voice steady. She didn't dramatize Kayla. She didn't romanticize the Monroes. She told the story the way a prosecutor tells a story when the evidence is the spine. Kayla Monroe worked late. She left alone. She was intercepted within minutes. She was injured in the vehicle used to stage a crash. Her body was moved into another car, wrapped in plastic, and sunk in deep water. This defendant had motive, opportunity, and a pattern of obsessive behavior. The evidence will show that he didn't just take her life. He tried to erase her existence. The defense objected, of course. They said speculation, assumptions, probability, not certainty. But the evidence came in like stones, one after another. A forensics analyst explained cleaned blood chemistry and why you can't truly wash away what happened. A lab expert explained probability matches in a way juries could understand. Not magic, not guesswork, but a measurement that grew stronger in context. The medical examiner spoke with clinical calm about trauma consistent with a heavy, blunt strike. Jenna Price testified with a shaking voice about the pattern of watching, calling, showing up. And then Holt played a compilation of Keene's archived voicemails, backups recovered through old accounts, the kind of digital debris people forget exists. In one message, his voice sounded like pleading. In another, it sounded like anger wearing a mask. "Just talk to me," he said. "Just answer." Then, later, "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep ignoring me." And later still, the line that made Dana press her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. "If you don't talk to me, I'll come out there." The courtroom stayed silent when the audio ended, not because everyone agreed on guilt in that instant, but because everyone recognized the shape of control. The trial lasted weeks. The defense tried to suggest alternative suspects, shadowy figures, faceless possibilities. They tried to turn the staged crash into an unknown. They tried to turn the plastic sheeting into something anyone could buy. Holt didn't need to argue that nobody else could buy plastic. She only needed to argue what was true. The totality of evidence pointed in one direction, and there was no credible evidence pointing anywhere else. When the case went to the jury, Park sat behind the DA's table and watched the jurors' faces as they listened to the judge's instructions. He tried not to read too much into expressions. People look different when they're holding someone's life in their hands. 2 days later, the verdict came back. Guilty. Dana made a sound then, a small exhale that might have been a sob or a laugh, or nothing but the release of pressure. Mark held her, like he'd held her at the reservoir, like he'd held her at every vigil when the candles got fewer. Keene stared straight ahead, blank. Park didn't feel triumph. He never did. Even when justice landed, it landed on top of a grave. Outside the courthouse, microphones appeared, hungry and bright. Dana stepped up anyway. Her voice didn't shake. "For years," she said, "people told us to move on. But you don't move on from a child. You carry them. And we carried Kayla until the truth caught up with the lie. She looked directly at the crowd. You don't get to erase someone and keep living like they never existed, she said. Not forever. That night, they returned to the reservoir, not for closure, not for a cinematic ending, for quiet. High country recovery stood with them again. Hank Caldwell held his hat in his hands. Detective Park stayed back a respectful distance, watching the water and thinking about all the cases still waiting beneath surfaces nobody wanted to examine. Dana set a small candle on the gravel. The flame trembled in the wind, then steadied. We never stopped looking, she whispered. And the water, dark and indifferent, reflected the light back at her. Small, stubborn, persistent, like the truth.